Hi, my name is Kevin Slack. I'm Associate Professor at Hillsdale College, and this will be a course on post-60s liberalism and the New Left. Probably the most common question that I've asked of me by students and friends of the college is, what happened to my country? We were all around in 2020. We watched many of the American great cities burn, and there were two new authorities that emerged, or seemingly new. The first was a kind of COVID-19 authority. The phrase was follow the science. And it was under the claim of following the science that Americans saw all of their most important rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, constantly the threat to the Second Amendment right to bear arms. These came under threat. And they came under threat by unelected bureaucrats who were claiming authority under exception to the law, under emergency powers. The second was this new identity politics, seemingly new, as we'll see. And in identity politics, you find the authority of anti-racism or the trans movement. We saw BLM protests and Antifa agitators, and they constantly destroyed property and they instigated violence in these cities and seemed to have no repercussions, no penalties by the attorney generals or the police. And these ideologies were taught in schools. So there was a whole new gender fluid teaching that was introduced into elementary schools. In states like California, you had students who were given puberty blockers that would lead to sterilization without their parents' consent. In identity politics, or what was called critical race theory, you had this vicious anti-racism where white students are expected to apologize for their privilege for the sins of their people. And so many Americans wondered, where did this come from? Many conservatives are fascinated with the word liberalism. Where does it begin? And often they debate the difference between classical liberals and what we know to be liberalism today. The American founders didn't call themselves liberals or classical liberals. They called themselves Republicans. When we think of liberalism today, where did that word come from? The word, according to Walter Lippmann, who was one of the leading progressives in the 19-teens, he said the word came into the American lexicon in the election of 1912. Those who supported Woodrow Wilson for president in 1912 called themselves liberals because they couldn't call themselves progressives. That was the name of Theodore Roosevelt's political party. Why did they choose the word liberal? Well, they were borrowing a word from British politics, where liberal had ceased to mean limited government, protection of individual rights and private property, and it started to mean the securing of freedoms and liberties by an expansive welfare state. But Walter Lippmann wanted more than just a name. And so he looked to American philosophers, particularly John Dewey, to try to give the movement something more than what he called a hodgepodge group of political policies. And so he wanted a firm political philosophic background for this new movement. And this would be the basis of liberalism. We have to remember that the liberals were not the old American progressives. That was defined by a middle-class movement, Teddy Roosevelt's middle class. Those were WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the liberals were something of a different group. In fact, in one study, 60% of those progressive activists did not support the New Deal. So who were the liberals? Well, they tended to be those activists in urban settings, in the cities. They were pluralists. They had worked with minority groups from the Great Migrations from 1880 to 1920. What did John Dewey add, according to Walter Lippmann? John Dewey added a kind of detachment from concrete politics. The group around the New Republic Journal had gotten into difficulties and squabbles with Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And so they wanted both a detachment from politics that was firmly rooted in a new philosophy, as well as the ability to prescribe different policies. So let's approach the liberals from three different angles. The first is going to be, who are the liberals intellectually? The second is, what did the liberals do quantitatively, or the quantitative liberals? And then we'll look at the qualitative liberals, the kind of liberalism that emerges in the 1960s. And then we'll conclude with an assessment of liberalism and how it comes into difficulties. So first we look at the liberals intellectually. Who were they? Philosophically, the liberals prided themselves on being experimentalists. John Dewey said that he was moving from absolutism to experimentalism. The liberals saw themselves as breaking with 2,000 years of Western metaphysics. It meant that they were challenging the 2,000-year goal of philosophy to understand the essences of things. John Dewey argued that this approach suffered from two major difficulties. The first is that to search for the essence of something, you're presupposing the end. Let's say you're looking for the ultimate good in life. You're already presupposing the good before you begin the inquiry. And so Dewey said it always corrupted the inquiry itself. The second is, Dewey said that the old philosophy collapsed under psychological questioning. He didn't ask what the essences of things were. Rather, he wanted to know what was the psychology of somebody who was pursuing absolute essences. And he said the flaw in philosophy for the last 2,000 years was that philosophers really wanted a sense of certainty about the world, that there was something religious, there was something revelatory in the questions they were asking. Rather, Dewey said, that instead of looking for absolutes, what really embodied the human animal as a problem-solving creature was a certain type of mind, a certain pattern of thought, and that was the scientific method. So the scientific method was more than just an instrument. The intellect itself was a tool, but the scientific method, say, in formulating problems and in formulating hypotheses to solve those problems, was actually the way that a peak human mind behaved or performed. For Dewey, the key was to always ask new problems, and that an active mind was always searching for possible solutions to these problems. Well, what problems? Instead of the old philosophic approach where we had certain set problems that were part of human nature, rather Dewey argued that the problems would arise from the situation themselves. This may seem to be unsatisfactory, but Dewey argued that philosophy proceeded by asking new questions entirely, not answering the old ones, simply proceeding beyond, moving beyond the old questions. In defense of Dewey, instead of looking for some absolute good with a capital G, rather, those who were philosophers ought to focus on concrete problems in their society, goods with a little g, and the plural goods that we could attain in this life. It would mean, Dewey said, a revolution in the way that human beings thought about themselves in the world. It would mean, he said, the rejection of the old absolute philosophy and a turn towards solving concrete problems in society. This leads to the second intellectual school of thought in liberalism, and that's psychology. Philosophy, in many ways, would become psychology. The new psychology for the liberals could best be explained in academia by behaviorism, and it can be explained in clinical psychology by Freudian psychoanalysis. Both of these understandings of the human mind claim to be scientific. For J.B. Watson or B.F. Skinner in academia, the idea was the prediction and control of human behavior. Human beings would be studied like rats. Basically, they were responding to the stimuli in the external world. If you look at clinical psychology, the question was, what was normal behavior for these rats? And so Sigmund Freud put together what he called the science of psychoanalysis. This is to be opposed to the older view of altruism embraced by the progressives. In that older view, the individual would act for the good of the society and would evolve over time to behave altruistically and to lay aside individualistic motives. And that's how society progressed. Sigmund Freud would shatter that understanding of human mind. Rather, everything was egoistic. Human beings were moved by unconscious instincts, sexual desires that were channeled into drives, their desire for different objects in the world around them, or for the images that were representations of those objects in the world around them. Freud's conclusion was that healthy individuals would balance what he called the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The pleasure principle was, is human beings want pleasure. The reality principle was, is you can't always get what you want. And so human beings that were healthy would learn a kind of balance between pleasure and pain in the real world, understanding these limitations. And that precisely is what Freud said was wrong with the modern world. That is, human beings in modern technological society were bombarded with so many inhibitions that didn't affect a primitive society. They were beginning to break down. The ego, the I, was this hub of demands placed upon the individual by unconscious instincts, by parents, by the external society. And to prevent the ego from breaking down under these increasing demands in modern society, he developed psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, the point of it was to make individuals aware, through free association with an analyst, of how those unconscious instincts were manifesting in the world around them so that they can get on with their life. They could carry out the work of the day. So, in Freud's solution, individuals would make peace with the selfish desires that the progressives had deemed to be sinful or asocial. The liberal goal of psychology was then to adjust citizens. They would adjust them to the social order on education, in economics, in race, and in sex. And we'll look at how that takes place. Thirdly, the liberals had a new idea of economic planning. They were not the same as progressives. The progressives had risen up in opposition to the trusts. They called them a plutocracy. And their solution in the 19-teens was either to continue trust busting under Woodrow Wilson, or in the later Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt, was to create scientific commissions or boards. You would have impartial boards and commissions that would formulate regulations for private industry. That way you would have scientists who would be moral because of their education, who would create the rules to constrain private business, which was motivated by greed. The liberals challenged this view that anybody could be so altruistic. Rather, what they forwarded was the idea of state capitalism or economic planning. In the words of Rexford Tugwell, literally, there would be no private business. Rather, the government and private industry would work together to plan the economy. So, the liberals expanded the progressive view of delegating lawmaking authority to government boards and commissions. The government would work with industry to plan different markets. The goal of the liberals was quite grand. They literally believed that they could adjust production and consumption. They thought they could manage trade, and they could distribute profits, and they could redistribute wealth in a way that would be equitable for those in society. In politics, the liberals were pluralists. Instead of the old progressive view that all would be made to fit a social organism, and that focused on the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, rather the liberals celebrated pluralism. They would balance the different interests and groups. That would be the different classes, the different religious groups, and the different ethnicities that had flooded into America from 1880 to 1920. The liberals would be realists when it came to popular sovereignty and democracy. Instead of looking to the people as being the source of sovereignty, rather liberals concocted a new idea of, quote, democracy. I say quote because there's no form of democracy that remains. There's no majority rule. Rather, the idea is that there would be managers in the state who might look to public opinion polls, quantitative research, and then they could know what was best for the people, who would participate in more periphery ways. But we've lost all the forms of republicanism or democracy in this liberal order. The way that FDR described it in his Commonwealth Club address was that there would be a new social contract. The people would give the government power, and the government would give the people rights. This is a far cry from the old natural rights view of the American founding. And what would those rights be? Well, FDR said that those rights would be redefined by statesmen. It means you would redefine the rights to life, liberty, and property. They'd become ever expanding as the social order changed. So how were these liberal ideas in economics and politics? How did they manifest themselves in quantitative liberalism? Quantitative liberalism was the creation of an American welfare state. And this takes place, as most of us know, during the New Deal. The New Deal from 1933 to 1945, or we'd say the outbreak of World War II. The New Deal can be summarized by several points. The first is that it would provide relief. So the stock market crash in 1929 was not the Great Depression. Rather, it was a series of gaffes by the Federal Reserve and by the federal government that led to a Great Recession. How would it provide relief? Well, through a series of government interventions. There was the Federal Emergency Relief Act from 1935 to 1943. There were programs like the Works Progress Administration. These would put Americans to work. So instead of simply giving Americans a handout, they would give them a job, and thereby they would retain their self-respect. But also, it would allow for government intervention so that it could constrain competition in the economy. The liberal argument was unbridled competition had led to the overproduction, the narrowing specialization in, say, agriculture, where farmers were all producing the same kind of crop, that had led to the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Another form of relief was in home ownership. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created so that Americans could own a home. and the federal government gets involved in helping Americans adjust their mortgages. And so they create the home ownership society as we know it. Before then, you would have to save up 50% for down payment to buy a home with interest rates that were higher. The second component of the New Deal was recovery. Recovery meant growing the economy. The liberals believed that they could understand the science of economics well enough to where there would be no need for recessions or depressions ever after. So to grow the economy, there needed to be a control of competition. And for this purpose, the liberals created a series of boards and commissions. In 1933, there were two major acts. The first was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the NRA, an administration that would regulate prices and would regulate markets and industry. Unsurprisingly, this was the idea of Gerard Swope. Swope was from General Electric. Large corporations tend to like regulation insofar as they can work with it, and insofar as it bars smaller businesses from competition. And the industry codes of the NRA were something astounding. They regulated all kinds of things, all the way down to strippers' tassels as to the kind of material they could be made out of. Or you couldn't buy a particular chicken. You had to buy 12 of them in a big lot because that was fair for consumers. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 created marketing orders by which the Secretary of Agriculture would regulate the markets in agriculture. Essentially, the Secretary of Agriculture would work with the largest growers to regulate agricultural markets. Again, this is something that large growers favored, and if you were a small grower, you could be worked out of the market. Through the AAA, the federal government introduced subsidies for farmers, price controls, and marketing orders to order markets. And most importantly, it's in the New Deal that the federal government creates most of what were called the Big Six regulatory boards and commissions. These would be boards of experts, scientists in economics, working together with producers to plan the economy. The first two of the Big Six commissions had been around. That was the Interstate Commerce Commission of 1887, which wasn't given legislative powers until the Hepburn Act of 1906. They would regulate railroad rates and even fix railroad rates. The second was the Federal Trade Commission that had limped along since its creation in 1914. The other four were created just prior to the New Deal or during the New Deal. The Federal Power Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the Civil Aeronautics Board. Again, the point was for government to work together with industry. So in this partnership, government would be the senior partner. This is not to say that you have a cartel system. The liberals prided themselves on rejecting cartels. That was the stuff of Nazistic fascism. Rather, the liberals always made sure they slapped monopolies down or conglomerates down. Wright Patman, who was in the House Banking and Currency Committee, made sure that antitrust was always carried out against these very large companies. And it means that in 1938, during the New Deal, the federal government began to break apart these trusts. In fact, 50% of all antitrust cases since the introduction of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 began in the New Deal from 1938 to 1942. Quantitative liberalism extended in what was called the Second New Deal from 1936 to 1938. And this is where the liberals decided that they could redistribute wealth and power to disadvantaged groups, the elderly, poor, labor, minorities. They introduced the Social Security Act of 1935. At that time, life expectancy was 59. There would be 49 workers for every one recipient. They expected that most people would never live to see their Social Security benefits. They extended this with this pot of money sitting around with few to collect. They extended it to new groups, survivors and the disabled, over time. The Democrat Party also will forge long-standing constituencies from labor and minorities. The Democrats created in 1935 the National Labor Relations Board through the Wagner Act. And this board would make sure that any workers who wanted to unionize, they would send federal agents to shop floors to ask if the workers wanted to unionize. If they said yes, then they would make sure that they received an election. And by this means, we find union membership explode. They also gave the NLRB power to oversee the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. This guaranteed a 40-hour work week, minimum wage, overtime, and child labor laws to prevent child labor. By 1941, there are 10.5 million unionized workers, and those who are in unions, a large percentage of the electorate, some 35% at one point, were guaranteed Democrat votes. The second group are African Americans. Blacks had voted in 1929, 75% Republican. The Republican Party had been the party of Lincoln. But because of different policies in the New Deal that we will see later on when we get to the civil rights class, because of those policies, blacks will vote 75% Democrat at the end of the New Deal. When we conclude this era of quantitative liberalism, what we see is a complete transformation in American government. If you go to 1929, 57% of all non-defense government expenditures are at the local level, 12% at the state level, and 30% are at the federal level. By 1940, 26% of all non-defense government expenditures are at the local level, the state level 17%, and the federal government 56%. There's also an explosion in the number of bureaucrats from 1929 to 1940, some 600,000 to 1 million, and a new kind of administrative law because of the creation of this large administrative state. A new kind of lawyer was needed who specialized in compliance and non-compliance. So next we move to what's called qualitative liberalism, and this is a product of the Cold War and what is called the liberal consensus. World War II created a problem for the liberals. And the problem is that liberals had celebrated the fact that they were not absolutist, they didn't believe in absolutes, and this is what made them better in a way, that they were rationalists. But the war had required men to sacrifice. Absolutely. If you give any soldier a weapon and tell him to go fight and die, he's got to fight and die for something. And World War II brought about the deaths of 400,000 Americans. So the liberals engaged in mass propaganda through the FCC and constrained what it is people could say on the radio and so on. And so the liberals produced a series of propaganda documentaries called Why We Fight.
Causes and events leading up to our entry into the war. Well, what are the causes? Why are we Americans on the march?
And the reason they had to produce these is because a large number of American soldiers didn't know why they were fighting. According to certain studies, 1/10 of Americans lacked a consistent, favorable view of the war and why it is that they were fighting. The Four Freedoms was an attempt to try to establish a justification for why Americans were fighting. But they found that 1/3 of American soldiers had never heard of the Four Freedoms, and only 13% could name 3 or 4 of them. And so the liberals began to talk about liberalism as a, quote, fundamental faith. The Bible of post-war liberalism was Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s vital center. And here he forwards the idea that the liberals, what made them unique was the fact that they opposed absolutisms to the right and to the left, but they were now a fighting faith worth sacrificing for. He introduces in 1949, and the book came out again in 1962, the idea of the horseshoe theory. The horseshoe theory is a liberal theory. It's the idea that liberalism appears to be opposed to two radical wings, the left and the right, communism on the left, or fascism on the right, and the liberals always equated laissez-faire business with fascism. The argument was laissez-faire brings about impoverishment so that the people turn to a strong man, Mussolini or Hitler, to try to create equitable conditions in the society. But the liberals said the radical left and the, quote, militant right really were the same. In that horseshoe model, both of them reunited to become the totalitarian opposition to the liberals who were the vital center. It meant that the liberals were friendly to business in a way that the communists were not. This was very successful for the liberals, this idea of a horseshoe theory. If you look at all the presidents of this period, Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, LBJ, they're all liberals in this centrist mode. As the liberals, after they defeat fascism, it's not as if the war ended, they just changed enemies. And so the liberals are fighting an ideological war on both the right and the left. In both the Democrat and Republican Party, we find the liberals waging war against the groups they called extreme. In the Democrat Party in 1948, Harry Truman and the Democrats are going to oppose Henry Wallace, who was much more to the left. In fact, he even received an endorsement from members of the Communist Party in the United States. And they begin to weed out the old so-called progressives or the communists within the Democrat Party. On the right, what we find is a battle between the centrists and those that they called the radical or the militant right, people who were in favor of laissez-faire, people who they believed had taken anti-communism to extremes. The real question in the Republican Party was, would the party try to scale back the increase in the size and scope of government of the New Deal? Eisenhower argued the party should not. And it would be that centrist faction that wins out in the Republican Party, whether it was Thomas Dewey or Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Rockefellers, Nelson Rockefeller. You had these centrist East Coast Republicans who defeat the more populist base in the Republican Party, usually identified with Robert Taft, called Mr. Republican, the senator from Ohio. Eisenhower had written to his brother that no Republican could attack the innovations of the New Deal and leave the Republican Party intact. They needed to make peace with the New Deal. And he called his conservatism dynamic conservatism, which meant he would retain the innovations of the New Deal. So there was a liberal consensus. Republicans and Democrats disagreed over concrete policies, but they did agree to maintain the welfare state at home, and they agreed on war against communism abroad. This introduced a problem for those in the Democrat Party. Eisenhower had so successfully co-opted liberalism that conservatism ever after meant conserving liberalism. That's often the case today with conservatives who call themselves conservative. They're often 1950s liberals. And so the liberals in the Democrat Party knew they needed to run on something else, and so they invented the idea of qualitative liberalism. They introduced the idea of the affluent society. They attacked the consumerism of 1950s American life under Eisenhower. Eisenhower expanded government. He expanded highways. This is the way he could buy off the suburban constituency. By 1960, as many Americans had moved off into the suburbs as lived in the cities. And so Eisenhower could please this constituency with the Highway Act to run highways out to these suburbs. Qualitative liberalism meant that the Democratic Party would not be at peace with consumerism. They called this the affluent society, where Americans, instead of searching for some kind of great national good, were only interested in their private profits in private life. John Kenneth Galbraith was the popularizer of Keynes and Keynesian economics. He argued that with all of this extra revenue, instead of returning it to private business and private individuals, rather they should spend that money on large public works programs that would instill the American people with a sense of national purpose. What were some of these causes? Well, they would be things like civil rights and a war on poverty, or helping to create democracies abroad in foreign policy. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who is going to advertise this new qualitative liberalism in the 1962 edition of the Vital Center, would go on to work in the Kennedy administration. And Kennedy would introduce proposals for a new frontier in the society, a new Civil Rights Act. And while Kennedy was slow to act, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, would take up these policies with gusto. Lyndon Johnson, who had something of an inferiority complex, he was kind of the big man who's insecure because he's taller than everybody else. He felt insecure because LBJ had come from rural Texas. He'd grown up in the New Deal policies of Texas, and he felt insecure around the Northeastern liberals, the Kennedys, highly educated elites in the Democrat Party, who often made fun of Lyndon Johnson, who was brought on the ticket just to secure Kennedy the victory in 1960. So Lyndon Johnson, with bluster, would say he was going to out FDR. In fact, FDR was a little too conservative for his taste. And he introduced all of the policies of the Great Society. For example, in the war on poverty, LBJ would introduce VISTA, the idea of sending young college students into urban areas, the same way that Kennedy had sent them overseas in the Peace Corps to try to improve local neighborhoods. The Job Corps, the federal government would take those who were uneducated and provide them certain basic skills. They would ship them off in some cases 1,000 miles away, to teach them basic skills like typing. The community action programs, this is where they would organize poor people to form constituencies, essentially for the Democratic Party in the city. Importantly were the 1965 Medicare and Medicaid amendments to the Social Security Act. This would secure health insurance for the elderly as well as for the indigent and the poor in Medicaid, a jointly funded state-federal program. To try to solve the problem of racism, and the liberals prided themselves on their color blindness, The Democrats worked with the Republicans to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act to make sure that blacks were registered in the South. It was a way of taking aim at racism in the South and segregation. To try to improve the cities, and LBJ argued that the Great Society would take place in the cities, the countryside, and the classroom. To try to improve the cities, there was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It would subsidize mortgages for the poor and increase the number of rentals. Here, LBJ argued that everyone should be able to afford a home or to be able to rent, and the federal government would subsidize those who were poor in the cities to do so. In the countryside, LBJ is going to sponsor legislation for conservation. In the classrooms, the liberals passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts. And what these do is they provide scholarship and funding for local school districts. The liberals thought this was a great way to buy Democrat votes. The liberals introduced many of the policies we're familiar with today: scholarships for students, low interest rate loans, financial aid. The liberals also wanted to change culture. The claim was they would free culture from corporate influence. And so they introduced the NEA, the NEH, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So shows like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers wouldn't be the product of corporate influence, but rather would be a way for intellectuals to educate children free from that influence. Probably the most important act of the Great Society was the 1965 Immigration Act. What this did is it eliminated the national origins quota that had been passed by the Progressives in 1921 and 1924. And so in the 65 Immigration Act, there would be no preference, in fact, even a discrimination against all of those trying to migrate from northwestern Europe. Before, with the quota, about 70% of the immigrants were coming from 3 large countries in northwestern Europe. Post-1965 Immigration Act, the liberals argued that it would introduce more Southern Eastern Europeans. They were called the pigs, the Poles, the Italian, the Greeks, and the Slavs, which also included Jews. And so they argued this would give rise to more of these immigrants. In reality, what it did was it greatly increased the number of migrants from Asia and Latin America. This, for the liberals, was a very good thing. They prided themselves on their colorblindness and their pluralism. The liberals in foreign policy, remember, were waging a war against a broad ideology, first fascism and then communism. And so the way they waged war was very different. The liberals introduced what was called the idealist-realist split. The realists were the ones who said, insofar as the United States is waging war in what was called the Third World, neither capitalist nor communist, but these developing nations, it meant that you had to recognize you had to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And so you had to do all kinds of nasty things that would not be acceptable in domestic policy if you were going to ensure peace in the world. And in the post-war liberal order, where the United States had the world's reserve currency through the 1944 Bretton Woods Act, where the dollar was the world's reserve currency, redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. In the realist-idealist split, the liberals introduced the idea of what's been called global meliorism. What that meant is that the liberals could justify their interventions in foreign countries, even the propping up of puppet dictators abroad, because they claimed that they would eliminate hunger, despair, disease. They argued they would promote democracy. The Marshall Plan, for example, was the sending of some $13 billion to Western Europe to prevent the rise of communism in those countries. When you look at the intervention in Vietnam, this was argued by LBJ to be a war on poverty, not here at home, but abroad in Southeastern Asia. LBJ forwarded the idea of a Tennessee Valley Authority in the Mekong River Delta. The liberals viewed their foreign policy as an extension of the domestic policy, a New Deal or a Great Society abroad. They would wage war against communism under the new authority of social science. It was a different kind of warfare. Today we call it counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency was a form of war developed by the colonialist powers of the 19th century. It meant you would send soldiers into other countries, and instead of simply taking land, you would try to win the hearts and minds of the people. You would change their culture. This is what the liberals introduced in Vietnam and in other countries. Vietnam was called the social scientists' war. Experts would model the war. They would use computer simulations. Instead of waging a war by territory taken, they would report body count. And so we were winning the war in Vietnam because the news media would report another 60 killed. And we had the same kind of grand tactics. Again, not grand strategy, grand tactics form of warfare that has continued ever since in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the liberals were tallying irrelevant statistics. They would talk about pacified villages, body counts, rice yields, school attendance. LBJ would ask the question of, are you bringing democracy to the hamlets of Vietnam? The result of all of this, the qualitative liberalism, the quantitative liberalism, would be a new economic policy. The liberals create the welfare warfare state. They're spending vast sums of money, and they're able to paper over the massive deficits, what was called the unified budget. The unified budget took all of the money collected for Social Security, and the government would loan itself that money at interest that it would pay itself back for the discretionary side of the budget. Let me read some statistics about the change in the American economy that takes place because of this liberal era. From 1964 to 1970, federal transfer payments for social insurance and public assistance programs doubled from 24 to 52 billion. In 1971, the federal government for the first time spent more on welfare than defense. From 1949 to 1979, the total housing, economic, and welfare spending rose from 10.6 to 259 billion, and that was more than half of the budget. Even as defense rose from 11.5 to 114.5 billion dollars. Lobbyists poured into D.C., all trying to get a corner on Great Society spending, and it would produce relationships between business, Congress members, and the bureaucrats in what was called the Iron Triangle. And this also led to what was called the revolving door, where those who had been in public service would take jobs paying out 2, 3, 10 times as much as they had made in public service. This leads us into the next lecture, which is the radicals' revolt against the liberals in the Great Society, where the Great Society is often viewed as being a radical movement. It really wasn't the case. All the programs of the Great Society will become a battleground between centrist liberals and the young radicals who rise up to oppose it.